Friends, welcome to Hidden Treasures' second event, Treasures from Britain's Synagogue Archives, and thank you for joining us. I am Marie van der Zyl, President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Hidden Treasures is an initiative of the Board of Deputies, the representative body of the Jewish community. We're so very pleased to be celebrating the archives throughout the country that tell our community's story. As we reach the Board of Deputies' 260th anniversary, we continue to be a central body in the history and the life today of Jews in this country. Our 300 deputies represent synagogues throughout the country, including all denominations, Spanish and Portuguese, Federation, the United Synagogue, Masorti, Reform, Liberal and Independence. Their records tell the story of our community. I'm particularly involved and equally at home at both the West London Synagogue and Mill Hill United. The archives of the West London Synagogue and United Synagogue are both held in the London Metropolitan Archives. We're delighted tonight that Professor David Newman will be telling us about his discoveries at the LMA, and thank you also to all our speakers joining us tonight. I'm excited and deeply proud that the Board of Deputies has launched this project and delighted to be involved this evening. It really means a lot to me personally, so thank you. It now gives me the greatest of pleasure to hand over to the Archives and Heritage Manager of the Board of Deputies, Dawn Waterman, who has been the most amazing driving force behind this groundbreaking project. Thank you, Dawn, for all of your work to bring this to fruition. And now, over to you.
Thank you, Marie. As you say, Hidden Treasures showcases and celebrates Jewish archives in Britain. They tell the stories of Jews in this country through artifacts, photos, oral histories, documents, videos, and other archive material. Our oldest items date from the 11th century. Most recent is dated last week. Nearly 40 archives have joined the project so far, and we always welcome more. We've got national and local archives, university special collections, and specifically Jewish archives. Big and small, general and specialist in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Do have a look at our website and follow us at Seeds Trust. We even have our own archive, the COVID-19 Living Archive. We're collecting digital material, much of it from synagogues, showing the practical, compassionate and inventive ways which the Jewish community has been responding to coronavirus. So we've got flyers about the mobile sukkah in Liverpool and about the children's goodie bag, which could be picked up from the synagogue car park at a shul in Salford to be enjoyed at home on Simchat Torah. Do send in your contributions to the archive. Our next event is Hidden Treasures Jewish Heirlooms on a Zoom, a sort of Hainisher Antiques Roadshow, when we'll be inviting you to send in digital images of the unusual Jewish artifacts or documents you have at home. We'll match some of them with experts and find out more. I hope you'll join us. But today's event is about synagogue archives. Over the last month or so, Hidden Treasures has been highlighting their treasures. Items like a magnificent photo of the opening of Hull Central Synagogue in 1914, which comes from the Hull History Centre, or the architect's plans for additions to Cathedral Road Synagogue in Cardiff, which were drawn up by the deliciously named Delissa Joseph in 1897. They come from the archive of the Jewish History Association of South Wales. One of the great pleasures of this project has been talking to many of the dedicated people at synagogues throughout the country who collect material that tells the story of their own shul and their local Jewish community. I've heard about the exhibitions they put on at Belmont, and visited Ealing United, masked and socially distanced, to see an exhibition about the history of the shul. They got the programme from a fundraising concert they held at the London Hippodrome in 1928 that had Gracie Fields on the bill. How on earth did they get her? I've heard about the relationships between synagogues and their local archives, in Sheffield, for example, and in Barnet, which has just taken in the archives of Finchley Reform Synagogue. And I've heard about digital and oral history projects, such as the one at St Albans Masorti Synagogue. The marvellous Nicola Avery from the London Metropolitan Archives has written top 10 tips for synagogues, which you'll find on our website. Today we're going to hear about two archive projects, one in London and one in Tyne and Wear, and to hear more about exploring the London Metropolitan Archives, which is such a fantastic source of material from across these synagogue denominations. Over now to Gillian Merrin, the Chief Executive of the Board of Deputies.
Thank you very much, Dawn, and good evening to everybody. And we are surely in for a treat this evening, as we've heard from Dawn. And thank you, Marie, for welcoming us all. And I would echo your warm welcome to everybody who's joining us. I'd like to introduce the panel for this evening, and we are looking forward to hearing you all talk about the treasures from Britain's synagogue archives. And I think it's worth making the point that I do know that this is an exceptionally busy time for you all, as you are dealing with the challenges of the pandemic and continuing your very important and exciting work. So thank you from all of us at the Board of Deputies. So first of all, we have Dr. Rachel Lichtenstein, and Rachel is reader in the English and History Department at Manchester Metropolitan University. And Rachel was the archivist and historian at the Sandys Row Synagogue in Spitalfields, London, and she's going to talk to us about her work with our Hidden Histories project here this evening. Secondly, we are absolutely delighted to welcome Professor David Newman. Originally from the UK, David holds the chair of geopolitics at Ben Gurion University in Israel. And in 2013, he was awarded the OBE for promoting scientific cooperation between the UK and Israel. David is an enthusiast as a user of the Jewish archives at the London Metropolitan Archives, and that's what he's going to be talking about tonight. And his focus, and this will be intriguing, is going to be on synagogues, letters, and rabbis. And our third panelist, welcome to Lizzy Baker. Lizzy is the archives lead at the Tyne and Wear Archives in the Discovery Museum in Newcastle. She's going to be talking about the exciting Lahav project, which will tell us the story of Jewish communities in Newcastle and the North East. So after we've heard the short presentations from each of the panelists, there will be a chance for you, our audience, to ask questions. So if you're watching, don't be shy about using the chat button to submit a question or comment for our panel, and I'll look forward to putting your thoughts to the panelists. So with no more ado, over to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Could we have the slides up, please? Okay, I can't see the slides. Oh, here they come. So it's been my great pleasure to have been working in very close collaboration with the active community of Sandys Row Synagogue as their historian and archivist during the past few years. I've been helping the community with the assistance of their president, Harvey Rifkind, board member Rose Edmonds, a number of volunteers, and the Bishopsgate Institute archives, which are situated nearby, to gather, document and record the unique and fascinating history of this building. Sandys Row Synagogue in Spitalfields was founded in 1854 by 50 pioneering Dutch families, and since that time the building has never closed its doors. It's now London's oldest Ashkenazi synagogue and the last fully functioning synagogue in Spitalfields, situated in the heart of London's former Jewish East End. The main building is over 250 years old and originally functioned as a French Huguenot chapel. And for many years, the synagogue was also the headquarters for the Stepney and Whitechapel Street Traders Association. The basement space, which you see here, was once used as storage space for the market traders, and items from the time of the Huguenots were also found in the basement, along with many records belonging to the Jewish community of Sandys Row. The photograph that you see here, taken by Morley von Sternberg, shows a volunteer from Sandys Row in the basement sorting through some of the Torah scroll covers that we found there. This picture is taken from the Sandys Row digital archive website, ourhiddenhistories.com, which documents the entire project. Could we have the next slide, please? Over a long period of time, we cleared the basement and transported all of the handwritten records of the synagogue to the nearby Bishopsgate Institute archives, a Victorian institution established by philanthropists to provide educational facilities for the poor of East London. We catalogue, digitise and transcribe the records, which included 19th century marriage certificates, various papers, minute books, and other documents. The short film that you see represented in this slide documents the entire process and includes archive footage from the surrounding area, interviews with volunteers and members of the synagogue, and is freely available to view online on the Hidden Histories website. Can we have the next slide, please? Alongside recovering and documenting and preserving the artifacts from the synagogue, we attempted to tell the long history of the building on the timeline section of the website, which you can see here. The story starts when the site that was once open land, called Artillery Gardens, named after Henry VIII's Royal Artillery, who were gunners of the tower in the 16th century. Using maps and images from Sandys Row and Bishopsgate, the timeline reveals how the area developed when French Huguenot Protestants purchased the plot where Sandys Row Synagogue now stands in 1763 and erected a chapel there. It continues to document the story from the 1840s onwards, when Dutch Ashkenazi Jewish migrants began arriving in Spitalfields. They settled in the narrow streets around the synagogue and set up businesses in the tobacco and diamond cutting trades, with skills being passed on from generation to generation. The timeline continues to tell the story through to the present day, describing the founding and the development of the synagogue, telling the story of how one of the most famous synagogue architects of the time, Nathan Solomon Joseph, was employed to remodel the former chapel and develop it into the synagogue, and also the story of how Sandys Row has kept its doors open through 2 world wars and remained active from its original consecration in 1870 until today. Can we have the next slide, please? The archive also includes an oral history collection of past and present members of Sandys Row Synagogue. These members spoke of a place once bursting with life, an area filled with kosher butchers, slaughterhouses, friendly societies, and Yiddish-speaking traders from the nearby Petticoat Lane Market. I loved hearing their stories of this lost world. Today, it's almost impossible to get any sense of a Jewish presence in the area anymore without an expert guide, as Spitalfields has changed beyond recognition. The next slide, please. If you click on the website onto the audio files on the oral history pages, you can see photographs of the people that we've interviewed and listen to short audio excerpts of their rich memories of this place. The full oral history recordings, along with summaries and transcripts, have since been deposited in the Bishopsgate Institute and are available to for the public to access in the reading room. Next slide, please. As mentioned before, the digital archive is freely available to view on the website, and it also includes a full photographic record of the Judaica of the synagogue and this incredible collection of Torah mantles, which were discovered in a cupboard underneath the ark. After being dried out in the basement, they were photographed, then transported to the Bishopsgate Institute. Some of these covers were given as gifts to Sandys Row Synagogue, and many have been dedicated in memory of members of the congregation or in honour of special events. The majority were made by the Ladies' Holy Vestment Society. They're a really unique collection, an amazing piece of social history. They're constructed, some of them from old curtains, dresses, and even one was made from material used for the seat of a train. They've been hand-stitched and embroidered with sequins and gold thread and buttons, and reflect the make-do-and-mend attitude of many of the working-class Dutch members of this community. Next slide, please. Within the collection, there are also the marriage registers dating from 1894 right up to 1986. We have now scanned and transcribed all of these historic documents, which are available to view and download from the website. The registers list the names and ages and places of residence of people who were married at the synagogue during this period. And it's interesting to note in the early documents how many members of Sandys Row had Dutch names and were working in the cigar and diamond polishing industry. Next slide, please. This slide shows the wider page on the website, and as I say, it's free to download. Next slide, please. To date, nearly 150 historic records have been recovered from the Sandys Row Synagogue. We have completed scanning all of the handwritten minute books of the community, which date from 1872 through to 1963. Other documents in the collection include a seat register from 1896, the register for the Ladies' Society, the minute book for the Stepney Street Traders Association, and the rules of a committee. This slide shows a page from the earliest minute book in the Sandys Row collection. The first 15 pages of this book are written in Dutch, as the majority of the board members during the 1870s were Dutch speakers. The first minutes in English are dated the 6th of September 1873 and start with a Mr. Magnus defending himself after being seen stepping off a train before Shabbat ended in Brighton. All of this original material has now been deposited at the Bishopsgate Institute. Furthermore, as mentioned before, the collection is available to view online at www.ourhiddenhistories.com, and it has also been deposited as a digital collection in the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People at the National Library of Israel, and is now, according to the director, the first full-scale archive of an Ashkenazi congregation from London in their collections. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rachel. It was fascinating. And what struck me when you talked about this is a lost world, it would be completely lost if it wasn't for you, the work of you and your colleagues. So thank you for bringing it so alive to us this evening. And it gives me great pleasure now to hand over the screen to David Newman. Over
Hi,
to you,
good
David.
evening. I'm speaking to you from the north of Israel, although I live in the south of Israel. But thanks to Zoom technology, we can do these sort of discussions. And if you could put the slide presentation up, please. Okay, thanks very much. What has happened is that I work in the field of geopolitics, but I come back to London a great deal, and I went searching for some material related to my own work at the LMA. This is about 3-4 years ago, when I was spending an extended sabbatical in London, and I suddenly realized all the Jewish archives were there. And like a good Jewish boy just gone past the age of 60, I was getting involved in nostalgia. I came from a family who were very involved in the Anglo-Jewish community as lay leaders and as rabbis, and so I started mooching around. And I've spent a great deal of time over the last few years doing both serious and sort of hobby research in the Jewish archives there. Just to mention very briefly in the first 3 or 4 slides, what exactly does the LMA have? It has the United Synagogue archives, it has the Beth Din archives, the archives of the Office of the Chief Rabbi, the Board of Deputies, the Federation of Synagogues, Jewish Memorial Council, and others, too numerous to mention. But you can imagine that each one of those is just a huge undigitized archive in its own right. And the treasures which are buried there in the boxes are just phenomenal. They're great, both for serious researchers, you know, PhD students, but also for many people who are looking into family and community histories. There's just a wealth of material there. And all I can do in the next 8 minutes is really just on the tip of the fork, just give you an idea of the sort of material there is there. If we go to the next slide, just a brief mention of how it works there. You can, thanks to I believe it was a Rothschild Foundation grant, at least a lot of the files here have been catalogued to the level of the file. Before that, it was just luck and chance how you search through the boxes. You can now go onto a search engine, as I'll show you in a second, and find the nature of the file you're looking for, the name of a rabbi, the name of a community. But of course, then you have to go there and physically see the material. It hasn't been digitized, and I assume it's far, far too much material to be digitized, just millions and millions of sheets of paper. But at least you can sit at home and do the search and get as close to the files that you want to, whether they're names of rabbis or names of communities, and so on. One of the few problems I would say, since I have a captive audience here today, is that although they are all on deposit at the LMA, you normally need to get permission, be it from the United Synagogue or the Board of Deputies, who are, by the way, very forthcoming on that, from the Beth Din, to be able to access these archives. And obviously we understand there can be sensitive material in some of those files, but I think it could be made a lot easier for more people simply to go along and use those archives without having to go through a whole bureaucratic process of getting extra permissions. And that's an appeal I'm throwing out here, so that more people go and use this material. If we go on to the next 2 slides, or the next one, you can see, just as an example, I threw in Chief Rabbi Hertz and correspondence. It comes up with some major files, and then go on to the next one, and then go on to the next file. And you go on through 3 or 4 categories, and you come right down to congregations, correspondence with congregations listed alphabetically. And I'm delighted that this one came up, because I found just the most amazing files of correspondence about the Bangor Jewish community in World War II, thick files of hundreds of pages, where, guess what, the community had a row, a faribble with their rabbi. They wanted to get rid of him. He appealed to the Beth Din in London. And eventually in 1940, which is already during World War II, the Beth Din took time out to go to Bangor. They took the train to Liverpool, stayed overnight, went the next day to Bangor to try and resolve this issue. They thought they had resolved it. They went the whole way back to Liverpool and to London, took up nearly a week on this journey. By the time they got back to London, they had a telegram from Bangor to say that the rabbi had rejected their compromise. And this is a sort of typical material you will come up with in tens, if not hundreds of communities in these archives. Some of it fascinating, some of it humorous, much of it which shows you that there's never anything new under the sun when it comes to Jewish communities or when it comes to arguments about kashrut or about rabbis and so on. Let's go to the next slide. One of my great interests is in synagogues of the UK. Some of you may know I started a Facebook site called Synagogues of London and the UK, which is quite popular, and lots of interesting material goes up there. The classic book here of the three is The Lost Synagogues of London by Peter Renton, which is very hard to come by the way. If you want to get a copy and you go on eBay, if you can find one available for less than £150, you're doing well. It's a very popular book. I'd like to do a second edition of that because so many synagogues have closed in the 30 years since he wrote that book. But within the archives in the LMA, there are many files relating to the history of synagogues. Next slide, please. And I'll just give you one example of which I'm interested in. The Dalston Synagogue, which was in Poets Road. There's some ancient pictures from the end of the 19th century when it was a synagogue. You can see the beautiful inside. On the right, there are pictures of the young rabbi in the 1950s, who just happened to be my father, being inducted at the time. And then on the bottom level, you can see pictures of when it was boarded up at the end of the 1960s, ready to be knocked down. And you see that pretty horrible picture of a block of council flats that replaced it. But the interesting thing is they found that the synagogue had been built before the houses themselves. Therefore, the sidewall and the pillar could not be knocked down, and it's still out there. And that's a picture of me standing by the pillar there. I actually grew up on top of that synagogue, in the rabbi's flat on top of that synagogue. And we're working very hard at the moment, together with Rabbi Mendy Kora in Islington, to try and get the council to put a plaque on that pillar to say that this is where the Poets Road Dalston Synagogue existed for over 100 years. And that sort of historical material you'll find for many different synagogues within the archives at the LMA. Next slide, please. You come across things by chance. I was looking for correspondence of my great-grandfather, Jacob Rabinowitz, who was the rabbi in Edinburgh. He had many arguments with his own community before he came to London. And I came across by chance a whole about 32 original letters written between him and the Chief Rabbi Hertz at the time, trying to resolve this issue. I came across boxes, including the Tyne Kaplan files. Probably some of you remember the scandal about 30 years ago when books went missing from the London Beth Din, and all of the material was there. I'm not sure the United Synagogue really meant to put the material there on open access. The United Synagogue celebrated this year its 150th anniversary. They were looking for material to see how they had celebrated the 100th anniversary, and I managed to find for them the 2 boxes of photos of the 100th anniversary. If we go to the next slide, next slide, not me. Can we have the next slide, please? I've lost you. Next slide.
It's on its way, David.
And I came across this box of about 40, 50 pictures. That was the United Synagogue 50 years ago, everyone in their top hats. And again, there's always the personal thing. The bottom right picture, that sweet little boy talking to the Duke of Edinburgh, is none other than me with Isaac Woolston and the Queen there. And these were used for part of their 150th anniversary celebrations. Next slide. And you come across pictures of the Orthodox Rabbinate. Yes, this is the Orthodox Rabbinate going back to the 1920s and 30s. Chief Rabbi Hertz down there in the middle. And you can trace the development of the ministry, the Anglo-Jewish ministry, throughout the 20th century in these files. Next slide. And the final point I want to make is, of course, there are files full of letters. The 2 most prolific, I would say, or most interesting sets of letters to be found are those of Chief Rabbi Hertz, who was the chief rabbi for over 35 years and during both world wars, and Diane Abramsky. Abramsky's letters are fascinating. Here you see 2 letters, which one relating to his son, who he was trying to get a job for after he managed to get him out of Russia. It was hard to bring him into England because he was a known communist. He later became the famous Professor Shimon Abramsky. And on the right, you see a letter he addressed to the Home Office trying to bring in his daughter or his granddaughter from Palestine after some of her family had been killed in 1948. To go to the next slide, where you see many letters between him and famous rabbis from throughout the world. He was considered to be one of the greatest halachic authorities in the world when he was in England, and also later when he went to Israel in the 1950s. And there are valuable letters there from him to rabbis, from rabbis to him. But one other thing I need to point out, and this comes up a lot in Jewish histories which are being written about communities now, of Scotland, of Wales, of Ireland, and that is a lot of the material, particularly the old material, is in Hebrew or Yiddish. And people don't always have the skills to be able to read these letters. And therefore, a lot of the histories being written are limited to the English material only, and a lot is being missed from the histories. I have just 2 more slides to finish with. If we go to the next slide, this is the slide that probably the letter more than anything else that sent shivers down my body when I found it. It was a letter addressed to Tyne Abramsky in 1946. For those of you who can see, the stamp on the letter is from the rabbi's office or the rabbinate office in Bergen-Belsen. After the camp was opened up and liberated, it was still used as a place to house refugees for the next 3 years. And they set up refugee agencies and offices. And it really sent a shiver down my spine to see, first of all, if you read the content of the letter, the very difficult questions he was asked, Abramsky was asked to answer by the rabbi at the time. But to see that stamp of the rabbinate's office in Bergen-Belsen was quite an eye-opener. And if I come to my very last slide, and that is to say, one of the things that we have to watch out for is that there are people who look for these letters for other reasons, not for research, but because rabbis' letters have become a big business these days. Next week in Jerusalem, there's a big auction of something called Otrot Yerushalayim with many of these letters, and it's not sure in every case where their provenance is. I've been contacted on two occasions by people who have heard that I've been at the LMA and said, can you get me these letters? And I've said, absolutely not. But of course, I've told them they are welcome to go and look at the letters and to take photos, which is permissible. But these letters are very valuable, and it's very important, obviously, to keep these things for research and not to let them out for the private market. That was literally a tip of what there is to be found at the LMA. You could sit there for years, and as I get closer and closer to retirement, I think I'm going to spend a lot more time at the LMA. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We'll always know where to find you. And I really appreciated you bringing in your personal stories and the stories of your family into your presentation. It brought it alive for us. And I was very struck in your presentation when you remind us of what we all know. There's nothing new about how people behave. And so with that, I look forward to hearing now from Lizzy Baker. Over to you, Lizzy.
Hello, everyone. So my name's Lizzy Baker, and I'm the archives lead at Tyne Archives. I should have some slides, which I'm sure are coming. Marvellous. So yes, Tyne Archives are part of a wider organisation called Tyne Archives and Museums. So we're a local authority archive service, and we serve the areas of Newcastle, Gateshead, Sunderland, North Tyneside and South Tyneside. So really quite a big historic area, and an area that's had quite a lot of Jewish communities, not all of whom obviously are still there. Can I have the next slide, please? So we are based at the Discovery Museum in Newcastle, and this is where we store the archives, and it's also where in normal times where there is a search room for people to come and consult them. That's not something we're doing at the moment. So this building here is our home. This is Blamford House in Newcastle. It's a former cooperative warehouse. Our collections date back to the 12th century for the Newcastle and wider Tyne and Wear area, and date up until the present day. And we hold our collection in total on over 12 miles of shelving. And so it's a really very, very sizable collection, one of the biggest in the country. We have a particular strength in collections relating to historic industries on Tyneside, in particular things like shipbuilding. Now, part of these collections, we do have quite a few collections specifically created or relevant to the Jewish communities in our area, including synagogue records, cemetery records, records of schools, charities, social organisations, etc. We do have a user guide on our website if anybody would like any further information, and the address for that is www.twrchives.org.uk. So can I have my next slide, please? So I'm here today to specifically talk about the Le Havre Jewish Heritage Project. So this is a project which is funded by a bequest made by Ron and Kath Le Havre, who lived in Newcastle for a while and were members of the Jewish community here. And they had a great deal of affection for the area. So their marital trust made a bequest to Newcastle City to develop a heritage collection and to tell the stories and history of the Jewish community in the Northeast. So Tyne and Wear Archives are working on this project jointly with Newcastle Libraries. We're partners, and we're able, therefore, to cover between us book collections, archive collections, and museum collections. So we have quite a broad approach. There was some initial work on the project done in 2017, but then we started properly towards the end of 2018. We have a project coordinator called Alistair Wilson, who works on the project 3 days a week. The overall project aim is to collect, preserve and celebrate the history of the Jewish community in North East England from its inception to the present day. Now, we aim to do this in lots of ways, but primarily we're looking at developing collections of archives, books and museum objects which will tell the story of Jewish history and the North East. We then want to provide physical and digital access to these collections with a wider aim of broadening awareness and understanding of Jewish history in the North East. We have had lots of plans for activities, which lots of them haven't actually been that possible this year for the obvious reasons. We're in the process of rewriting our project plan now so that we can actually adapt it to the COVID restrictions and social distancing. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about digital alternatives to some of the things we had planned. We're talking about the possibilities of digital exhibitions. We're looking at having online talks instead of in person, etc. I think as every heritage organisation has probably done similar to us. So I'm just going to run through some of the things we have been able to deliver for the project so far, and then I just think about some of the ideas for the future. So one of the things that was a really high priority for us when the project got started was to do some oral histories. So we've done about 25 oral histories, mainly with older members of the community or with people who have, I suppose, a history with the Northeast. So we have done interviews with people who no longer live in the Northeast but grew up in the area. And that's been really interesting to be able to talk not only to people who are still based in Newcastle or the Northeast, but who have actually moved away. We've had an excellent exhibition in Newcastle Library on the history of Jewish life in the city, which unfortunately didn't have as long open as we would have liked before having to close in March. So we are now looking to follow that up with a small exhibition within the Discovery Museum later on this year, as the museum is now open again. We're working on developing a collection of archives, books and museum objects. Newcastle Library in particular has developing a really good collection of loan and research material, and we're looking at taking in further archive and museum objects as they're offered or as we talk to people about them coming in and becoming part of a permanent collection within our holdings. We have held a roadshow event at the United Hebrew Congregation in Newcastle, where we talked to members of the community and we collected archives and objects and some small oral histories. And that was a really lovely day, and we had plans to do another, but unfortunately that's rather been taken out of our hands, that one. One of the things we did do was we filmed a ceremony at the Newcastle Reform Synagogue, which was around the return of one of the Czech memorial scrolls after it had been repaired and rededicated. And this was a really moving event. I'm very glad we were able to be there, and it was a real honour to be invited to film that event. There will be a short film on that ceremony, which will be available on our website shortly. We have some minor tweaks that need to be made to it, and then it will be able to go onto our website. One of the other projects we're working on, which I have to admit I didn't put on the slide, is we're in the process of uploading to Flickr a very large photographic survey of all the Jewish gravestones across the northeast England. So they are going up in batches as we speak. It does take us a little while to go through and add all the data into each one and then upload it. But that will be a very significant resource once that's up and available. And that's down to the work of Peter Gatoff, who's been around and photographed all of them. And we've been working on the metadata to get them up online. Actually, if we can go on to my next slide. There we go. One of the things we have also done is we've taken a photographic survey of the United Hebrew Congregation Synagogue in Newcastle, which has now closed. We were able to bring in a photographer to carry out this documentary survey. So there's a record of that building. And this is the nice things about this project. It's an opportunity not only for us to collect what's already existing, but an opportunity for us to create new collections like photographic surveys or the oral histories. I suppose really I should just finish off by thinking about what we'll be doing in the future. There's a lot of ideas we're talking about at the moment, and we're hoping to have a meeting with the community soon to talk them through in a bit more detail. But obviously, we're not going to be able to do anything in person in the short term. So we're looking at alternatives like walking tours, or can we get blue plaques up? Can we look at online exhibitions or online talks? So that was a very brief run through of the La Havre project.
Well, thank you very much, Lizzy. And what I'm sure struck us all was the challenges that you've had to face because of those challenges being presented by the coronavirus situation, but how you're meeting them and still continuing to do your work. So thank you for that. And a reminder to everyone watching, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be delighted to receive your comments and questions. So do let's have them through your social media channels. So now I'm going to turn to the panel with some questions, and I'm going to kick things off by asking about what I'm going to describe as the digital revolution here. And you've all referred to it one way or another, but it would be really good to hear from you how you feel that's affected not just actually what it's like to be an archivist, but also how those of us who are not archivists are seeing archives and our history and our collections. And I make that point particularly because people like me really come alive when we can see and touch and kind of hear directly. And archives may not do that anymore because of the digitization. So over to the panel, really, about your views on the digital, as I call it, revolution. And I'm going to start with Rachel, then go to Lizzy, and then David.
Well, I personally have been very excited about the digital revolution in as far as archives. I remember the first time I saw something a handwritten manuscript on an iPad, and that ability to kind of zoom in and really explore it in your own way. I found it very, very exciting. And as an artist and a writer and archivist, I enjoy very much exploring archives in the reading rooms, that excitement that Professor Newman talked about being in the London Metropolitan Archives, actually touching the real things. But I think what's so exciting about the digitization of archives is the access and the fact that everybody can have access. And, I'm so thrilled that the Sandys Row Archive exists, not just in a strong room and a few people can see it in the reading rooms, but it's online in the website and can be accessed from anywhere from all over the world. And that also the National Library of Israel, the Central Archives of the Jewish People, are, that the head in the world about how they're preserving digital Jewish archives as well. And that's another really important conversation. How do you preserve these digital archives for the future? So I'm all for it. I think it's fantastic to open it up to people.
Thank you. So a vote from Rachel there for the digital. Lizzy, your view?
I think I'd say very similar. Digital has just revolutionized the way we work. I mean, if not just in the last kind of 6 months, our work would have been dramatically different without access to digital in that time. I think there's something really important and valuable about the ability to hold and touch real archives and have that physical connection to the past. But I think we have to understand and move with the fact that actually a huge number of people are accessing archives for their informational value rather than for an experience in touching or accessing them. We talk a lot about the ways in which people's expectations of accessing information have now shifted very dramatically. We're only, it's not that many years since the introduction of the first smartphone, but think about how much that has revolutionized the way we live. The comparison we sometimes talk about, bizarrely, between archives is with banking, in that 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even if you wanted to move money into account, you probably went into a branch and you might even speak to a human being to do it. Whereas nowadays, if you're still commuting, you just sit on your train and move money if you need to, and that expectation of what people want to be able to do. I think it's really important that we give people access the way that they want to be able to access it, while still retaining the ability for people to actually have that hands-on experience when they want it. There is also something really important for a regional archive like Tyne and Wear to be able to have that international reach. We are a very international city, Newcastle. I talked about the shipbuilding records. That will be a really crucial one for us. That links us to everywhere in the world, pretty much. We need to be able to let people from all over the world have access. So yeah, digital's essential. Poses some challenges, but essential.
Another vote for digital. And Lizzy, I've got to confess, I remember when fax machines were introduced, so never mind smartphones, but that tells you more about me and my age than anything else. But I should tell the whole panel that we've had a number of enthusiastic comments from the audience about your presentations, and I'm sure you're driving a lot more traffic to the various websites that you're referring to. And there's a comment up on the screen at the moment from Chris Godbold saying, we had no idea that there were so many Dutch Jews who came to London. Lots of research to be done when there's time, all very worthwhile, thank you. And I mean, that's the whole thing about this evening's panel. You're drawing our attention to things that we either didn't know or we'd forgotten or we just had missed. So thanks, Chris, for that comment. And for Trevor Haynes, and I'm about to turn to Professor Newman, David, really fascinating archive material. I'd agree with that. And with that, I'm going to turn to David to get your views, David, on the digital revolution.
Like everything to do with technology, technology is here, it advances, and we always have to know how to use it best, not to say whether we're for or against it. There's a huge thing today in universities, huge funds going into the whole issue of digitization of humanities, particularly for historians, for archives, and we realize how this benefits researchers. It can speed up the time they do research, although they still want the same 4 or 5 years to finish their PhD, but that's another question. And of course, it means you can access things internationally. Research students don't always necessarily have the funds to go from Israel to New York or to London and spend 3 weeks there. It's an expensive process. So obviously, it's very good to be able to do this. Yes, it does take away that great thrill of being the detective and finally finding the document you've been looking for. And I should also mention it's a very expensive process. So when you have a government or a national library behind you, that's great. But as I said at the beginning, the chances of these huge archives at the LMA being digitized, unless someone, some generous donor comes along and puts £10 million in the pot, is very unlikely. So there's still many, many of these archives which are going to remain non-digitized, and therefore, need to be preserved in the same way that they always have been in the past. And last comment is to make is, of course, that during the last 6 months, the digitization of these archives has helped many researchers to carry on with their projects, which otherwise they would have been unable to do.
I mean, that's very true. I mean, none of us could have predicted a global pandemic, but clearly actually having access to digital means has meant that archives have remained available, open, and can continue to be developed. So actually it was a way to future-proof against something we could never even have planned for. So thank you all for that. I'm going to go to a point you made, David, and I'll start with you. And it's a question I've got in about public access. And David, you commented in how interested people are in archives and presentations. So I'd like to sort of put to you the question about how do you see public engagement in the projects that you're doing? How important is that, and what sort of level of public engagement? So I'll come first to David, and then to Lizzy, and then Rachel.
So I have two comments to make about that, pardon me. First is to say that I'm a great believer in popularization of history. I know that not all academics are into that. They think it should all be left for the research students. I think there's plenty of material there for the serious, heavy research, but I think it's great for people to be looking into their family histories, their community histories, and to be able to access all of this material. And I would like to think that many of the archives we've been talking about will be as widely accessible as possible with as few bureaucratic obstacles, although we do accept that obviously the nearer you come to the modern period, there are names, there are people, they could be still alive or their parents are alive, and they can be sensitive and sometimes material has to be closed. We accept that, but I think overall the material should be easier to access than it is at present. The other point I want to make, which ties in with this, is to say that of course local Jewish archives have very interesting histories. Because often there are bits which are missing, or there are archives which are to be found in the attics or the basements of past presidents of synagogues who wanted to keep them for themselves. You were talking about the Tyne and Weir archives. I spent 3 years as a PhD student in Durham, living in Newcastle, actually next door to the Jesuit synagogue. This is going back 40 years. At the time that Louis Holsover came out with the book of the Northeast Jewry, and there are very significant parts of the history there which are missing, and which it is said that maybe these were the periods when he was the president and he didn't necessarily want them published. This was one of the arguments going around. So of course, like all archives, Jewish archives are about communities, they're about people, they're about egos, and we need to get hold of as many of them as possible. There's always going to be a lot of the material which is missing.
All very true what you say, David. Lizzy, public engagement.
I mean, it's crucial to our project. It's one of the really big driving forces within it. Obviously, one of our aims is to broaden awareness of Jewish impact on the Northeast. So we have to do that through public engagement. We are obviously, as I suggested, having to think quite carefully about what that public engagement is going to be in a socially distanced world. So we're looking at all sorts of opportunities to do that. But I think it is absolutely crucial. You can have the most amazing collections in archives and a huge range of people interested in accessing them, but a very small proportion of them who will necessarily come in with a research question and actually sit down and use those archives. I think there's a lot of people who have an interest who maybe don't have a question they need to answer, but they do want to have a look through those archives. So I think that's really where things like exhibitions and talks and presentations and walks and all the other things we can do, where that really comes in and can really make something that on paper can occasionally look quite dry, can really make those stories come alive and really make them sing. So
thanks, Lizzy. And I'm sitting here thinking actually about how important archives are in generating pride and connection with being Jewish. It's becoming clearer and clearer to all of us in all that you're saying. Yeah. Rachel, tell us what your view on the importance or otherwise of public engagement.
Absolutely essential, and public engagement was at the kind of core of this project right from the offset, which it was a kind of community, collaborative, participatory project that involved many members of the synagogue and also lots of volunteers. So they actually got involved and engaged in finding out about their own history. We did it all together. And then alongside that, this was a kind of 5-year project. So we've had numerous exhibitions, we've had tea parties with people who are involved in the oral history project. We've been part of festivals like the Spitalfields Immigration Festival, where we've talked about the Sandys Row Archive project, walking tours around the area, and many other things besides. So I think the actual gathering and digitizing of the archive can be a community event that lots of people get actually engaged in the process of doing it.
I think that's a really good point, actually, the way, in fact, it can bring us to get our history and the way in which we are treating it, saving it, preserving it, can actually bring us together. It's a very powerful thing. And you're all very fortunate to work in that field. The question I'd like to go to now is one, I'm just going to read it to you. It's from Harvey Kaplan. So thanks very much for your question, Harvey. And this is the question. First of all, an observation. The Scottish Jewish Archive Centre in Glasgow has large quantities of synagogue records, including minutes, registers and letterbooks of the Glasgow Hebrew congregation from 1850s onwards, and the minute books of the Edinburgh Hebrew congregation from the 1860s onwards. And digitisation is really useful, but we also need to look at models of online access, and there's also a need to fund the storage, maintenance and conservation of the original material. So Harvey makes some very powerful points there, and I'm going to come first to Lizzy for your comments on those, and then to David and then to Rachel.
Absolutely, completely agree. I think one of the things archivists tend to say is that when you digitise material, you're not solving a preservation problem, you're creating a new preservation problem. You just have two different long-term preservation issues to resolve. So yes, digitisation in no sense takes away from the fact that you have to continue the storage, preservation and conservation of the original material. And in fact, quite often you have to do the conservation before you're able to digitise it. It's always an important factor in pricing up anything like that. And digitisation is expensive. Digital storage is quite expensive as well. So yes, it's not a quick fix and it's certainly not a cheap solution, but I think you have, yeah, absolutely right. You have to get the online access right as well. I think this is one of the reasons we're exploring lots of different avenues with this, and we're trying to use existing platforms. So this is why we've used Flickr to put up the gravestone images, for example, because there's a large community of people who already look at Tyne and Wear archives and museums Flickr images, and we can therefore put album by album up quite gradually. I think we're on about 40 million Flickr views on that album, so it's certainly, you know, that account in general, it's certainly very popular. So I think it's important to look at a variety of different online models. Nobody wants to be with one particular one that then ceases to work, so we're trying to be quite broad in our approach.
And Lizzy, you mentioned about your work, both in your presentation just now, about the photography of headstones. And again, something that I hadn't thought about, and I'm sure many of our viewers didn't, which was, of course, archives aren't always the old stuff. Sometimes it's the ways of capturing our history that are new ways that are just as vital in terms of creating an archive.
Yes,
and creativity is absolutely key there.
Yeah, definitely.
So, David, your thoughts about models of online access?
Yeah, I think it's the other side of what we were saying about the ease of access and the technology. Obviously, digitization enables the archives also to get rid of material which isn't really critical material to create. They're not, you know, important documents, but which they simply don't have room for. But then, of course, they're the least important documents. They anywhere at the end of the queue. A few years ago, I was asked by what's his name, the guy who ran from the Beth Din United Synagogue, Charles Tucker, to have a look at boxes of the Marcus Carr archives, whether they should be added or kept at the LMA, or not. And we spent some time looking through about 130 boxes and found there were only really 4 or 5 boxes which really had new or different material, which didn't repeat itself from other boxes. Now, and I think a lot of it was disposed of in the end. And of course, digitization enables you not to do so. I'm glad that Harvey brought this up with respect to Edinburgh, because Edinburgh is one of the topics on my agenda. One of the many, many UK communities where I had ancestors who came from Lithuania and were rabbis, and we've been looking for material about this person for a long time. You just have to dig below. A lot of the archives sometimes are to be found in strange sources. They may be in the local government offices. They may be in the court systems. People went to court for all sorts of court cases. And one of the things that digitization can obviously do is create the links and bring all this material together, although they're in very different physical locations.
That's absolutely right. And Rachel, your views?
Well, it's a kind of chicken and egg conversation in a way. You know, what do you do first, digitize or preserve? I mean, obviously, and both things are very expensive and time consuming. I think we need to have more open discussions like this about Jewish archives, and I think it's fantastic, the website that the Board of Deputies put together, kind of making it accessible and just giving people that how spread out they are all over the place. And you know, as Professor Newman was saying, there's so much material that will never be digitized. I hope that Sandys Row archive might be seen as a model of how you can work directly with the community and with lots of volunteers to produce such a project.
Well, thanks for that, Rachel. And I'm just going to turn, and this is unfortunate, I don't know where the time's gone. It always goes when you're having fun and you're intrigued. And let me tell you, I would tell the panel what you said has been more than intriguing, and I think it's got everyone really excited about the comments that we've seen coming in. So I'm just going to ask you to give a brief answer to this, which is a question you could go on for ages, and then I'm going to come to you for your final closing brief comments. So the question is from Mark, quite specific, but on the back of that I'm going to ask something general. So Mark, and thank you for the question, Mark, says, my grandfather, who passed away in 1936, was a chazan at Great Garden Street Shul, which, by the way, is where our President Marie van der Zyl, her paternal grandparents, were married. But going back to Mark's grandfather, his name was Morris Bernstein. I heard they sacked him. Does David Newman know anything about this in particular? And are there any other stories of scandals uncovered? So specific to David, but to all of you, I'm going to say, is there one like fascinating, intriguing, scandalous story that's come to light from your work you'd like to share with us? But just some brief comments, but I will of course come to David first.
If you go through Synagogue and correspondence archives of chief rabbis with congregations and with their rabbis, there are scandals galore. It may be about bad behavior on the part of the ministers. Often, you know, that communities have nothing serious going on when their scandals and their arguments are about kashrus. Kashrus comes back and returns time after time after time again. Who is authorized? The Eastern European shoftim, or the ones appointed by the chief rabbi? Is the rabbi in charge of the kashrus? Is he making money on the side? All sorts of questions coming up here. There are scandals galore to be discovered. Of course, it depends what you define as a scandal and so on. And it is to be, I would think it's fair to assume that a lot of the really scandalous material doesn't find itself into the archives, or is that material which you still lack access to. Even though you have access to the archives, there are still certain files and boxes which they will tell you, no, this is closed, you can't have a look at that. And you wonder exactly what the reason is all about.
We'll never know.
Coming back to the specific question, all you have to do, who the person who asked about the Great Garden Synagogue, go online to the LMA, type in the search engine Great Garden Synagogue, and see what comes up. Now, you may find there are files just about that synagogue, or you may find that there are files about synagogues beginning with G in a certain period of time. And you have to follow that paper chase online until you get to a number of files you'd like to see, and then go down to the LMA and try and see those files.
Thanks very much for that practical advice, David. So, Mark, I'll leave that to you to follow up. I'm going to come to Rachel, then Lizzy. A particularly interesting story or a scandal you've uncovered?
Well, the biggest scandal or controversial story with Sandys Row Synagogue was actually the consecration of the synagogue, and it was quite widely reported at the time in the 1870s, because, as I mentioned, Sandys Row were a Dutch community, a kind of working class Jewish community in the East End, and the established Anglo Jewry wanted them to join the bigger synagogue and take the poor seats, and they were very determined to have their own synagogue and their own community. And this didn't go down well with the chief rabbi at the time, who kind of refused to conduct the consecration ceremony. So it was actually the Sephardic rabbi, unusually, who conducted the consecration ceremony. So that was quite a big scandal at the time, and interesting story.
Thank you, Lizzy. Anything for us?
I'm racking my brains for scandals, but I'm afraid I don't have any yet. But I think possibly as the project continues, we will discover more scandals, more information there. But I'm trying to think of things that we found been maybe slightly surprised by. I suppose it was a little surprising that one of our initial kind of interesting inquiries was actually from the House Through Tyne team when they were in Newcastle, because it turns out the house they were investigating was next to one of the former synagogues. So actually that was an early inquiry to the project. So that was a little bit of a surprise, at least.
Certainly so. So thank you, everyone, to the audience for their questions, and to the panel for being so gracious and open in answering. And I'm now going to ask the panel to give us one final thought, one final sentence about what we've been talking about this evening and what you'd really like us to remember. So I'm going to come to Rachel first, then David, then Lizzy.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important to remember the time that we're in. I was very privileged to work with that active community, the last surviving Jewish community in the Spitalfields area, once in a place where it was 150 synagogues. They're the last ones standing there. And, you know, since the lockdown in March, Sandys Row has been predominantly closed. They've lost all of their tours, their workshops, that these small communities are suffering and need our support as well. So please do go onto the Sandys Row website too and support these small Jewish communities.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Last word from David.
I would say for heavy researchers, there's plenty of material there. For people who are doing it for family histories and for fun, go and enjoy yourselves. And with another person we haven't mentioned, for those of you who at home have elderly parents or grandparents who unfortunately pass away, were functionaries in the Jewish community, and you find some odd cardboard boxes in your attics or basements, before you throw them out, take them along to a Jewish archive to see if they're relevant, or even do your own scanning on a phone and keep the material, because there could be some very interesting material there. And I just want to say thank you very much to the Board of Deputies for bringing all this together. I mean, there's just a wealth of material out there. There has been a lot written on Anglo-Jewish history. I mean, it's not as though it's an unresearched topic, but there's a lot more out there to be written.
Thank you. Thank you for your appreciation for the Board of Deputies. We are, as you know, very proud but very excited to do this Hidden Treasures project for our community. And Lizzy, you get the last word.
Thank you. I think it's just to say it's a real privilege to be involved in a project like this, and I hope we're able to really develop it in the next few years. I think one of the crucial things that's coming out of this for me is that it's really important that where archives exist, that aren't maybe put into a local authority or a university or an official, for want of a better phrase, archive, that if people do, or if communities do have material that they would like to be looked after, then I think it is definitely worth communities approaching their local archives or university archives, who may be the best places to look after them. We do have obviously very high standards we have to meet. We have to be accredited by National Archives, etc. So I would say it's just vital that this material is saved, because we can't tell these stories without it. So if you have anything, do think about where it could go live long term.
Thank you very much, Lizzy. And as I draw this to a close, I want to thank Lizzy Baker, Rachel Lichtenstein and Professor David Newman for being part of our Board of Deputies panel, our Hidden Treasures panel, and to say, well, I'll speak for myself. Fascinating doesn't really do justice to the last hour or so. It's been more than fascinating. It's been enlightening and enriching. And I just really got the sense from all of you, there's so much more to say and do. This is a living project. Archives are not dusty and fusty. They are very much part of today's life, and you've really brought it alive for us. So thank you to all of our panelists. And thank you also to our very generous media partner, the Jewish Chronicle, whose own archive, as you can imagine, is an absolute treasure trove to behold. And thank you to all of our viewers for watching and joining us this evening. Our next event is called Jewish Heirloom on a Zoom. And we will be, as Dawn mentioned right at the beginning, inviting you to send in images of interesting artifacts or documents that you might have at home, so that we can find an expert who'll be able to tell you more about some of them. So search out those things in your attics and under the beds and wherever else they're kept, because we want to have a look and be talking about them. And there's going to be more information about that on our Board of Deputies Hidden Treasures website. So I would like to again thank our panelists. You've been tremendous, and that's borne out by not just my feeling but the comments from our viewers. And thank you to our viewers as well for joining us. And I wish everyone a good evening, keep well, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Hidden Treasures event.